picture Argentina's wealth, and you picture cattle. The Pampas, grass to the horizon, flat and green and endless. Herds so large no one could count them. This is the image the country sold to the world, and the image the world kept. A land so fat with grazing that the animals ran half wild across it. And a fortune, surely, grazing along with them. The grass was real, the cattle were real. Spanish ships had unloaded the first cattle onto that coast in 1536. And on the open plain, with no fences and no predators, they multiplied into millions. And for 300 years, they made almost no one rich. The country stayed poor, empty. A blank space on the edge of the map, a colony the Spanish crown barely bothered to notice. The cattle were so plentiful, they were treated as a nuisance. Men rode out, killed them for their hides and their fat, and left the meat where it fell to rot in the sun. A whole animal, worth the price of its skin. The land was rich, the country was not. Both things were true at the same time, for 3 centuries. And then, in the space of a single generation, that reversed. By 1913, this same country, the same grass, the same cattle, was one of the 10 richest nations on Earth. Richer, per person, than France. Richer than Germany, almost as rich as Canada. There was a phrase that travelled around Europe in those years, used the way we might once have said, rich as a king. Rich as an Argentine. So here is the thing that does not fit. If the land had always been this fertile, and the fertility made no one rich for 300 years, then it was never really the land. And it was never really the cattle. What actually changed? The answer is not a thing you can hold in your hand. It is not a mine or a field or a single lucky discovery. It is a convergence. Several things arriving at once, from outside, and bolting themselves onto that grass in the span of about 30 years. A machine that had never existed before. Money that came from another continent. A network of iron laid across the plain. And a single window in the history of the world, when Europe was hungrier than it had ever been, and the ships to feed it had just become cheap. 4 things, and a 5th the story always forgets, because everyone remembers the beef, and almost no one remembers the wheat. Together, they made Argentina the answer to a question the industrial world was suddenly asking with real fear. Where is the food going to come from? But notice what all of it has in common. The grass was Argentine. Almost nothing else was. The machine was invented in France. The money was raised in London. The ships flew British flags. The market was a British city. The country supplied the one thing it already had in overwhelming abundance, and rented everything required to turn that thing into gold. This is the story of the richest thing that ever happened in South America, how it was assembled, and why, when the pieces were called home, it came apart almost as fast as it came together. Start with the grass itself, because everything rests on it. The Pampas is a temperate grassland that spreads out from the Rio de la Plata across the centre of the country. Hundreds of thousands of square miles of it, flat enough that a person can see the curve of the earth at the edge of a field. Beneath it lies some of the deepest, most forgiving soil on the planet. No stones to break a plough, almost no trees to clear, rain enough for grass, and mild winters that let animals graze the year round. It is so fertile that it caused problems no farmer in Europe would recognise. One agricultural observer, comparing it to the wheatlands of Canada, noted that the Argentine soil was so clean, so free of the weeds that choked northern fields, that it actually interfered with the harrows. There was nothing for the blades to bite. The land did not need to be fought. It only needed to be reached. And that is the whole problem in a single sentence. It only needed to be reached. Because fertility without a market is just grass. For 300 years, the cattle bred themselves into the millions, and a steer standing on the Pampas was worth almost nothing. Not because the meat had no value, but because there was no way to move the meat to anyone who wanted it before it spoiled. A cow in Buenos Aires and a hungry family in London were separated by 6,000 miles of ocean and about 6 weeks of sailing. The value was real. It was simply trapped by distance. So the early economy lived off the parts of the animal that could survive the journey. Hides for leather, tallow for candles and soap, and salted beef, tasajo, dried and packed in brine, hard and cheap, shipped north to feed the enslaved people on the sugar plantations of Cuba and Brazil. That was the market for Argentine meat for generations. The lowest value cut of the lowest value trade, sold to the people with the least power to refuse it. Then came the sheep and the first real fortune the grass ever produced. In the middle of the 19th century, before refrigeration, before the great railways, Argentina discovered wool. Settlers crossed the fine-wooled merino with the local flocks, and the Pampas, the same effortless grass, turned out to be nearly perfect sheep country. Wool had one quality meat lacked. It could survive the sea voyage without spoiling, and the mills of industrial Britain were desperate for it. Through the 1840s and after, sheep spread across the plain around Buenos Aires by the millions, and for the first time, the country exported something that made real money. Wool was the rehearsal. It proved that the grass could be sold to Europe, if only the right product could be found to carry the value across the ocean. But even the wool followed the pattern that would define everything after it. The mills that bought it were British. The ships that carried it were British. The country grew the raw fleece in staggering quantity and shipped it away raw to be spun and woven and sold at a profit by someone else. Argentina could grow the raw material as well as anywhere on earth. It could not, on its own, turn the raw material into money. It never learned to. It never had to. That required someone else's machines, someone else's ships, and someone else's appetite. The first of those to arrive was the iron. In 1854, Argentina laid its first railway, 10 kilometres of track, barely a gesture. Then the capital started coming, and the gesture became a network. British money chiefly. By 1880, around 2,300 kilometres of line. By 1914, 34,000. It was the 10th largest railway network in the world, the largest in all of Latin America, built in a single generation across an empty plain. Follow the money and the shape of the thing becomes clear. British investment in Argentina went from just over £20 million in 1880 to 157 million by 1890, a nearly 8-fold jump in 10 years. By the turn of the century, Argentina had absorbed something close to half of all the capital Britain sent anywhere outside its own empire. 4 great British companies built and ran most of the trunk lines. Their shareholders in London were promised returns of up to 7%, guaranteed, and for years they were paid. And here is what the iron actually did. It was not simply that trains were faster than ox carts, though they were. It was that the railway reached into land that had been worthless. Worthless not because it was poor, but because it was unreachable, and made it valuable overnight. A field of grass 300 miles from the coast had been, economically, on the moon. Lay a track to it, and it became part of the world market. The railway did not create the fertility, it unlocked it. And notice the shape of the map. The lines did not spread out evenly, town to town, the way a country builds roads for its own people. They fanned. Every major line opened outward from a single point, Buenos Aires, like the ribs of a fan, and everything they carried flowed one direction. Inward from the interior to the port, then outward from the port, across the ocean to Britain. The railway was not built to connect Argentina to itself. It was built to connect Argentina to a customer. Remember that. It will matter later. And it is worth understanding exactly how that money arrived, because the manner of its arrival was the whole vulnerability in miniature. Argentina did not, for the most part, borrow by walking into a bank and taking a loan. It borrowed by issuing bonds, printed promises to repay, which London houses like Baring Brothers and the Rothschilds underwrote and sold on to thousands of ordinary British investors, a widow in Surrey, a solicitor in Leeds, a retired officer with savings to place. They bought Argentine railway bonds because those bonds paid better than anything at home. And the railways themselves were often built under a state guarantee. The Argentine government promised the British companies a minimum return, commonly around 7%, and made up the difference out of its own treasury if the traffic fell short. The risk of laying iron across an empty plain was carried, in the end, by Buenos Aires. The reward flowed to London. To make all of it legible to foreign lenders, Argentina tied its money to gold. It fixed the peso through a national conversion office, so a lender in Europe knew precisely what an Argentine peso was worth in gold, and could send money in and draw profit out without fear of it melting away in his hands. It was a discipline. It made the country trustworthy to outside capital. But look at what that arrangement actually was. A country had made itself the ideal place for foreign money to come. Safe, convertible, paying 7%, guaranteed by the state itself. And a place built to be perfect for foreign money to enter is, by the very same design, a place that foreign money can leave the instant it changes its mind. The country had wired its entire prosperity to a switch, and the switch was held on another continent. But the iron alone was not enough. You could now move a live steer to the coast. You still could not move it across an ocean and sell it as fresh meat. The animal would be long dead and spoiled before it reached a British table. The last barrier, the ocean itself, was still standing. It fell to a machine, and to a man most people have never heard of. September 1876. In the French port of Rouen, an engineer named Charles Tellier loads meat into the hold of a converted steamship. He has spent years building a cooling system that runs on ether, a mechanical refrigerator large enough to chill a ship's cargo hold and hold it near freezing for weeks. He has named the vessel the Frigorifique, the cold one. He points it south at Buenos Aires and lets it go. The crossing takes 105 days. The machine runs the entire way. And when the ship finally reaches the far side of the Atlantic, the meat in its hold is still sound. By any business measure, it was a failure. The voyage was too slow, the machine drank too much fuel, and no one could have made money doing it that way. But Tellier had proven the one thing that mattered. Cold could cross an ocean. The last barrier was not a law of nature after all. It was just an engineering problem, and engineering problems get solved. 2 years later, in 1878, a ship called the Paraguay carried a cargo of frozen Argentine meat the other way, north to Le Havre, and this time it worked well enough to matter. The trade had begun. In 1882, British investors built the first frigorifico, the first industrial freezing plant on the edge of Buenos Aires. The plants multiplied fast once the principle was proven. Between 1902 and 1905, a cluster of new firms opened along the Rio de la Plata, the Smithfield and Argentine Meat Company, backed by British capital, La Blanca, the Frigorifico Argentino, La Plata Cold Storage, financed with British and South African money, and older local houses like San Sinena expanding to keep pace. The freezing plants became the beating heart of the whole trade, and most of the great ones were foreign-owned. There was a refinement, too, that changed everything. Early on, meat had to be frozen solid to survive the crossing, and frozen meat sold cheap. It was second-rate on a British table. But after 1908, better refrigeration allowed chilled meat, held just above freezing, to make the long voyage without turning to ice. Chilled beef tasted like fresh beef. It sold at the very top of the market. And Argentina, with its endless herds and its new plants, was positioned to supply exactly that. Then geography handed the country a gift no one had planned. Argentina's seasons are the mirror of Europe's and North America's. Its cattle came to market and its beef reached London precisely at the time of year when northern herds were thin and northern beef was scarce. Argentine meat filled the gap in the calendar that no northern producer could fill. The flipped hemisphere was worth a fortune all by itself. The trade grew so rich that the great American packing firms crossed the ocean to take it. Swift, Armour. They moved into the Argentine business around 1907, and by 1918, the American and British companies together controlled more than 2/3 of the country's meat exports. The single most profitable industry in Argentina was, by then, largely owned in Chicago and in London. The country raised the animal. Foreigners owned the machine that turned it into money, and foreigners took the largest share of what that money became. Now put the whole machine together, because this is the moment the fortune actually switches on. A steer is born on the Pampas and fattened, for nothing, on grass the country has in endless supply. It is walked or carried by British-built railway to a British-financed plant on the coast. There it is slaughtered, frozen, and loaded into the hold of a British-owned steamship. The ship carries it across the Atlantic to a British port, where it is sold to feed the workers of a British city. A city that has run out of room to grow its own food and has millions of new mouths born of the Industrial Revolution. Look at that chain again. Every single link in it, except the grass and the animal, is foreign. The technology is French, the capital is British, the railways are British, the ships are British, the market is British. Argentina supplies the raw beginning and the raw end, the land and the beast, and rents the entire middle of the process from the other side of the world. And it worked beyond anyone's expectation. In 1900, Britain banned the import of live animals for fear of disease, which only pushed the whole trade toward frozen and chilled meat, exactly the thing Argentina had built. New plants opened across the Rio de la Plata between 1902 and 1905. By 1905, for the first time, Argentine beef passed American beef in the London market. By the early years of the century, this one country was supplying more than half of all the beef exported anywhere on the planet. They started calling Buenos Aires the Chicago of the River Plate, a slaughter and shipping city, turning the animals of a vast interior into cargo for a distant world. It was meant as a compliment. It was also, quietly, a description of what the country had become. A place that converted grass into gold, using tools it did not own. And all of it, every frozen carcass, every sack of grain, had to pass through the eye of a single needle, the port of Buenos Aires. For most of the 19th century, Buenos Aires barely had a port at all. The river was too shallow for ocean ships to reach the shore. Cargo had to be ferried out to them on smaller boats, and passengers were sometimes carried the last stretch to dry land on the backs of men wading through the mud. A country exporting to the world was loading its ships by hand in the shallows. So it built one, Puerto Madero, a system of enclosed docks, dredged and walled along the waterfront, opened through the 1890s at enormous cost, and almost at once proved too small for the traffic pouring through it, so they built a second set of docks beside it. The concentration was extreme. As early as 1869, the Customs House of Buenos Aires handled some 88% of the entire country's export value. Even at the height of the boom, Buenos Aires and its neighbour La Plata together still moved half of everything the nation sold. A whole continent's worth of grass, squeezed through a few miles of dredged waterfront. Choke a port like that, and you choke the country. The fortune did not only flow one direction, it flowed through one place. And now the part the story forgets, because it was never only beef. The same grass that fed the cattle grew something else just as easily, wheat and corn. And the truth is that grain, in the end, mattered more. Before 1875, Argentina had to import wheat to feed itself. Within a few years, it was growing enough to feed itself. Within a generation, it was feeding Europe. The land under wheat went from around 1 1/3 million hectares in 1880 to more than 15 million by 1910. The growing season was longer than Canada's. The soil, as the observers kept marvelling, barely needed working. Farmers could plant on ground that in the old world would have taken years to prepare. By the 1920s, Argentina's exports had reached $1 billion a year, and 99% of that was agricultural. Maize and wheat had overtaken beef entirely. Europe stopped calling the country the Chicago of anything and started calling it something older and grander. The granary of the world, the breadbasket of a continent that could no longer feed itself. And it is worth asking who actually planted and cut all that wheat, because the answer is stranger than the golden fields suggest. Much of it was grown by immigrants who never owned a single acre of it. A tenant farmer rented a patch of some vast estate, agreed to hand a share of the harvest back to the landowner, broke the ground, raised a crop or two, and then, more often than not, moved on. The land was never his and never would be. He improved the soil, enriched the owner, and stayed poor. Stranger still were the golondrinas, the swallows. Every year, as the Argentine harvest ripened in the southern summer, tens of thousands of labourers sailed from Italy and Spain across the Atlantic to bring it in. And then, 6 months later, as the northern harvest came ripe, sailed home to bring that one in too. They followed the wheat around the planet, twice a year, chasing the season across the equator. The breadbasket of Europe was reaped, in part, by men who crossed an ocean to cut it and crossed back when the cutting was done. The fortune was built on their arms. Almost none of it stayed in their hands. But understand what actually made the wheat valuable, because it was not the wheat. Wheat grows in 100 places. What made Argentine wheat worth a fortune was the same machine that made the beef worth a fortune. The railway to carry it to the port, the ship to carry it across the sea, and the 30-year window when Europe was hungry, freight was cheap, and the whole world's grain trade happened to flow through a handful of southern ports at once. The grain was Argentine. The reason it was gold was borrowed. And it went further than wheat and corn, into a crop almost no one remembers now. Flax, grown not for cloth but for its seed, linseed, crushed for the oil that went into the paints and varnishes and linoleum of the industrial world. For a stretch of those years, Argentina was the largest exporter of linseed on the planet. Beef, wheat, maize, linseed, the country led or nearly led the world in all of them at once. It was, briefly, the single most important farm on Earth. And the reason sat in the ground itself. The soil of the Pampas is loess and deep, dark humus, laid down over ages, so rich and so free of stone that a plough could open it the first year and a crop could come the same season. There was no clearing of forest, no breaking of a hard frontier, no decades of improvement before the land would pay. It paid immediately. A settler could step onto the plain and be exporting within a year. That speed was the fortune. The land gave up its wealth faster than almost any land in history, which is exactly why so much of the wealth was gone almost before anyone thought to build something lasting with it. If Buenos Aires was the city built to move the beef, there was a second city built to move the grain, Rosario. Upriver on the Paraná, 300 kilometres north of the capital. The second port of the country, and they called it too by an American name, the Argentine Chicago. What does a city built entirely to move grain actually look like? Grain elevators along the river, tall and blind. Rail sidings running right down to the wharves. Ships riding at anchor, waiting to be filled. The whole town was a funnel, the wheat of Santa Fe and Cordoba pouring down the tracks from the interior and out through Rosario to the sea. It was not a city that happened to trade grain. It was a machine for converting a plane into cargo with houses attached. The mechanism was almost brutally simple. Grain came down from the interior in bags, sewn sacks of wheat stacked on rail wagons, hauled to the riverfront, swung into the holds of waiting ships by the ton. A commercial exchange grew up in the city to set the prices and broker the deals, and the whole rhythm of Rosario followed the harvest calendar of provinces hundreds of miles inland. When the wheat was good, the wharves roared. When a harvest failed, they went silent. A city entirely at the mercy of the weather, over a plain it could not even see. And then the money came ashore and built something no one had expected a cattle country to build. It built Paris, or something reaching for Paris, in the mud of a southern river delta. The village that travellers in the 1850s had called simply the Big Village became, in 50 years, one of the great cities of the world. They opened the Teatro Colón in 1908, 7 stories of opera house, ranked to this day among the finest in the world for its acoustics, sitting alongside the great houses of Milan and Vienna and Naples. They cut the Avenida de Mayo straight through the centre of the city in imitation of a Parisian boulevard. They hired a French landscape designer to lay out the parks of Palermo. Gas, electric trams, the newest of everything. For the centenary in 1910, they brought the best minds of Europe across the ocean to lecture to them. Marconi came, Anatole France came. The city wanted to be told by Europeans that it had become European. And the people came in numbers almost impossible to picture. More than 5 million immigrants passed through the port of Buenos Aires between 1870 and 1913. Italians above all, then Spaniards, then everyone else. By 1913, the city held 1.5 million people, and nearly half of them had been born on another continent. They came for the wheat frontier and the packing plants and the docks, for the wages of a country that seemed, for a moment, to have more work and more money than any place on earth. And at the very top, the wealth spent itself in a way the world remembered. In French, the saying had its own ring, riche comme en Argentine, and it was barely a metaphor. The great landowning families kept apartments in Paris and boxes at the opera. They educated their children in France, furnished their houses from London, and sailed home to Buenos Aires to spend the profits of the grass on a life imported whole from the far side of the world. It was said, only half in jest, that some shipped their finest cattle across the ocean to win prizes at European shows. The money was real enough to be spent that way. It was also, in the spending, a quiet portrait of where the country's heart had been placed, not in the plane that made the fortune, but in the capitals that took it home. They built those marble palaces and imported the stone to build them with, for a fortune they assumed was simply the way things were, as permanent as the grass. It does not seem to have occurred to them, why would it, that a fortune assembled almost entirely from other people's machines and other people's money and other people's hunger could be taken apart the same way it was put together. They built for forever. They were renting. One building said it more plainly than any speech. In 1914, the London department store Harrods opened a branch in Buenos Aires. It was the only Harrods ever built anywhere outside London. Not Paris, not New York, not any of the great capitals of Europe or the growing cities of the United States. Buenos Aires. 5 floors of it on the Calle Florida, selling the same goods as the Knightsbridge original to people who could afford them. The British had financed the railways that made the money, built the ships that carried it, and now they had come to sell the country its own prosperity back across the counter. Retail. But look closer at who was actually holding the money, because the phrase, the richest country in the world, hides a great deal. The fortune came in, and it pooled. The land had been carved up and handed out before the boom ever started to a narrow class of families. The great estancias, ranches the size of small European countries, belonged to a few thousand households. And when the export machine multiplied the value of every acre of grass, it multiplied, most of all, the wealth of the people who already owned the acres. The men who actually worked the land, the immigrants, the ranch hands, the workers in the plants, owned almost none of it. So, one of the 10 richest nations on earth was an average, and averages lie. It described a country where a handful of families held a fortune the size of an empire, and where the vast majority of the people who made that fortune possible saw only a wage. The wealth was concentrated at the top of a
very tall, very narrow column.
There is a comparison that makes the difference stark. At almost exactly the same moment, the United States was settling its own great grassland, and it handed that land out in small parcels, 160 acres at a time, to families who would own the ground they worked. It grew a nation of small landowners, a vast middle with a stake in the country. Argentina settled its grassland the opposite way. It handed the plain out in enormous blocks to a few, and the men who came to work it worked as tenants and hands on land they could never hope to own. 2 countries, 2 grasslands, 2 boom economies born the same decade. One built a broad floor of owners beneath the fortune, the other built a narrow spire, and it mattered what the spire did with the money. A fortune is only the beginning of a story. What decides the ending is whether it is spent or invested. The great landowners took their share of the export boom and, for the most part, spent it. On the palaces, on Paris, on imported stone and imported schooling and imported prestige. Relatively little of it was turned back into the country as new industry, new machinery, new kinds of work that might have grown on their own once the grass stopped paying. Why build a factory when the plane threw off money for nothing? The very ease of the fortune was the trap. It removed every reason to build the harder, slower thing that lasts. When the easy money finally stopped, there was very little underneath it that the easy money had made. And a spire is only strong in one direction. An economy that rested on a single export machine, owned at the very top by a few, had no second leg to stand on, no broad base of industry, no wide middle class of owners. One pillar holding up everything, beautiful and alone. And before we go any further, there is the ground it all stood on, because the grass was not empty when the fortune arrived. The Pampas was inhabited. It had been, for as long as there had been people in the Americas, the land of indigenous nations who lived across the plains south and west of Buenos Aires. In the 1870s and 1880s, the Argentine state sent its army against them in a series of campaigns it called the Conquest of the Desert. It was not a desert, it was their home. Thousands of people were killed. Those who survived were driven off their land, imprisoned, forced into labor, their communities broken, and their families separated and scattered. The campaigns were led by a general named Julio Argentino Roca, and their completion carried him into the presidency in 1880. He governed under the slogan of the age, peace and administration, order and progress, and it was under his governments and those that followed that the foreign capital poured in, the railways spread across the newly seized land, and the plain was open to the export machine. The clearing of the ground and the building of the fortune were not two separate stories. They were the same story, and largely the same men told it. The land that was cleared this way was then handed out, in enormous parcels, to the families and the companies who would build the estancias. The great ranches that fed the export boom, the wheat fields that fed Europe, they grew on ground that had been emptied by force and handed to the few. The fortune that followed was real, so was that. The grass that fed the cattle that fed the boom grew over it. Now, the crack that came early and was ignored. The fortune was made on the Pampas, but it was also, just as truly, made in London. The capital that laid the railways and built the frigorificos and dredged the ports came from British banks, and one house stood above the rest, Baring Brothers, one of the oldest and most respected banks in the City of London. They lent to Argentina on a vast scale, underwrote its government bonds, and sold them on to British investors chasing that reliable 7%. November 1890. Baring Brothers has lent too much to too many Argentine ventures that are not paying what they promised. The bank cannot meet its obligations. The oldest merchant house in London stands days away from failure, and its failure would tear through the entire financial system of the city. The Bank of England has to scramble a rescue, pulling in gold from France and Russia to keep one bank's bad bets on.
Argentina from bringing down the heart of the world's money. London survived. Argentina did not survive so gently. Its economy fell 11% in a single year. The government, suddenly starved of the foreign lending it depended on, cut the subsidies that had paid for the flood of immigrants. Loans dried up. It took the better part of a decade for exports to climb back to where they had been. And the lessons sat there in 1890 in plain view for anyone willing to read it. The fortune could be recalled. The money that had arrived from London could leave from London on a decision made in a boardroom 6,000 miles away for reasons that had nothing to do with Argentina at all. The engine that drove the whole country was never actually owned by the country. It was on loan, and loans come due. But the crisis passed, the lending came back, The boom resumed, larger than before, and rolled on into its golden decade. By 1913, Argentina stood at the very top of its arc. Top 10 in the world, the granary of the planet, the Paris of the South, the phrase "rich as an Argentine" still passing easily around Europe. The numbers of that golden run are difficult to believe even now. Between 1880 and the First World War, the economy grew roughly sevenfold, an average of something near 8% a year, sustained across 3 decades. Argentine income per person climbed from around a third of the American level to nearly 4/5 of it. The country's share of the entire world's output more than doubled, from under 1% in 1870 to nearly 2.5% by 1913. An astonishing figure for a nation of a few million people on the edge of the map. No country in the world had grown faster for longer. It looked from inside like the natural and permanent condition of the place. An English writer named Percy Martin, looking at all of it in 1905, wrote that Argentina had but just entered upon the threshold of her greatness. He was standing at what would turn out to be the summit, and he believed he was looking up at a mountain still to climb. It is one of the most quietly heartbreaking sentences ever written about the country. A man at the top of the arc, certain it was only the beginning of the rise. The turn, when it came, was not a single day. There is no date to point to, no crash to name. It was something slower and, in a way, more merciless. The gradual discovery that everything the fortune rested on belonged to the world outside, and the world outside was changing. Trace what the machine actually needed to run. 3 things, and only 3. Cheap freight across the ocean, open markets to sell into, and a steady flow of foreign capital. For 30 years, all 3 had been abundant, and all 3 had pointed at Argentina at once. Between 1914 and the end of the Second World War, one after another, all 3 failed. 1914. The First World War severs the 2 arteries at once. The shipping goes first. The vessels that carried the beef and the grain are requisitioned for the war effort or sent to the bottom of the Atlantic, and the freight rates on what remained soared beyond what a cargo of wheat could bear. Then the capital freezes. London, fighting for its life, stops sending money abroad. The flow that had built the railways and the plants and the ports simply halts. A country that imported the coal to run its trains and the machinery to work its farms suddenly could not get either. In the span of that war and the years around it, Argentine output fell by well over half from its peak. This was the crack of 1890 all over again. The same total dependence on foreign ships and foreign money. Except this time, there was no swift rescue and no fast return. The war did not end and hand the fortune back. It ended and revealed that the fortune had never been the country's to keep. Then the markets themselves began to close. In 1927, the United States banned fresh and refrigerated Argentine meat outright. One of the 2 great customers gone. And Britain, the one market that mattered above all others, hit by its own long industrial decline, began turning inward toward its empire, buying its beef and its wheat from Canada and Australia instead, raising tariff walls against everyone outside. The tracks, remember, all pointed one way, toward a single customer, and that customer was closing the door. And underneath the shocks lay a slower, quieter problem the boom had hidden all along. The whole miracle had grown in one direction only, outward. More land brought under the plough, more track laid, more grass turned to export. For 50 years the country had grown simply by getting bigger, but a plain has edges. By the 1910s, the last of the good free land had been settled, and the frontier that had fed the growth was full. Argentina had never built the other kind of engine, the factories, the diversified industry, the economy that grows not by getting bigger, but by getting better at what it already does. It had put everything into a single bet on raw exports, because for 30 years, that bet had paid better than any other bet on Earth. When the land ran out and the markets closed at the same time,
there was nothing underneath to catch the fall. Economists later gave it a name, the commodity lottery. The fate of a nation that ties itself to selling a few raw goods and rises or falls entirely on prices it does not set in markets it does not control. The dependence was so total that when Britain finally threatened to buy less, Argentina's negotiators crossed the ocean in 1933 and signed a pact to preserve their share of the British meat market almost at any price, accepting terms that favoured British goods and British firms in return for the promise that Britain would keep buying Argentine beef. It was the clearest confession the country ever made. It could not afford to lose its one great customer, and everyone in the room knew it. A nation that has to bargain that hard just to keep selling is a nation that never truly owned the sale. 1930. The Great Depression reaches the Rio de la Plata. The value of Argentina's exports collapses. Merchandise exports fell from over 2 billion paper pesos in 1929 to under 1.5 billion in 1930. A third of the country's foreign earnings gone in 12 months. Gold poured out of the country to cover the gap. The government abandoned the gold standard. From peak to trough, output fell more than 40%. And with its export markets shutting one by one, Argentina did the only thing a country in that position could do. It turned inward. Through the 1930s and after, it began to build a different kind of economy behind high walls. Tariffs to keep foreign goods out. New domestic factories to make the things it could no longer afford to import. The state reaching deeper and deeper into the running of it all. Economists have a name for this strategy: import substitution. Building at home what you used to buy from abroad. It kept the country working, it employed people, it made goods, it survived. But it never brought the old growth back. The single pillar, raw exports to a hungry world carried on borrowed machinery, was gone. And nothing built inside the walls ever grew the way that pillar had grown. Instead came chronic inflation, running into the double and then the triple digits and worse. The country that in 1913 had never needed to build a second leg now discovered it could not, and had waited too long to try. The economics textbooks would eventually file all of this under a single phrase: the Argentine paradox, the rich country that became poor, the cautionary tale taught in universities as the great warning of what a nation can lose. But that framing gets the story very slightly, and very importantly, wrong. Argentina did not lose a fortune it had built. It lost the use of an engine it had rented. The machines were invented in France. The money was raised in London. The ships flew foreign flags, and the great market was a foreign city, and the whole thing worked only during a single window in the history of the world. Those 30 years when Europe was hungrier than it had ever been. Freight had just become cheap, and every one of those forces happened to point at the Pampas at the same moment. When the window closed, the machines went home, the money went home, the market shut, and Argentina was left standing exactly where it had started, on top of the finest grassland on earth. So ask the question the whole story has been circling, and answer it plainly. What did Argentina actually get rich on? Not the cattle. The cattle had been there for 300 years and made no one rich. Not, in the end, even the land, because the land is still there and it is no longer a fortune. Argentina got rich on a moment, a convergence of someone else's technology, someone else's capital, and a single window of global history when all of it pointed at one plane at once. The grass was the excuse, the moment was the fortune, and moments end. And a pattern set in that would repeat, in different costumes, for the rest of the century. It always ran the same way. The country would find or borrow a new source of money, a commodity boom, a wave of foreign lending, a currency scheme that promised stability. Prosperity would return for a time, and with it the old habit of spending against the future. Then the price of the crop would fall, or the lenders would take fright, or the scheme would break under its own weight, and the money would drain out as fast as it had come, leaving debt behind. Since independence in 1816, the country would default on its debts 9 separate times. Its inflation, in the worst years, would climb past almost anything the modern world had seen. You can measure the reversal in the simplest human way. Argentina had been a country people crossed an ocean to reach, 5 million of them chasing the wages of the boom. As the fortune faded, the current began, slowly, to run the other way. The country that had been a destination became, for many, a place to leave. The nation that in 1913 was almost as rich as Canada would spend the century that followed as the world's standing example of how far a country can come down. Not because it did any single catastrophic thing, but because it had been rich once on terms it never controlled, and no one controls those terms for long. And here is the strangest part of all. The fortune left. The evidence of it did not. The Teatro Colón still raises its curtain every season, one of the great opera houses standing on Earth. The palaces along the Avenida de Mayo still stand, their imported French stone weathering slowly in a city that could not build them again today. The railway still fans out from Buenos Aires across the plain, grown over in places, gone quiet in others, toward ports that once loaded the wheat of half a continent. And there is a final irony written into that iron. In 1948, Argentina bought the British railways back, paid to take ownership of the very network that had built the fortune. It was meant as a triumph, the foreign hand lifted off at last. But by then the lines were aging, the traffic was thinning, and the great customer at the far end had gone. The country took full possession of its engine at almost the exact moment the engine stopped being worth owning. It had spent the boom renting the machine, and it bought the machine outright only once the boom was over. Harrods closed its doors on the Calle Florida long ago, but the building is still there, its name still cut into the stone above the entrance, in a city where no Londoner shops anymore. And the grass is still there. That never left. The Pampas still grows some of the best beef and the best grain anywhere in the world. The raw material, the thing everyone always credited for the fortune, was never the thing that departed. It sat there the whole time, before the boom and during it and after, exactly as fertile as it had always been, worth a fortune for 30 years and worth grass again after. Perhaps that is the truest thing the place has to teach. Not that fortunes fall, everyone knows fortunes fall, but that a fortune can be entirely real and photograph beautifully and feed a continent and still never entirely belong to the hands that hold it. Argentina held one of the great fortunes of the modern world for the length of a single generation. It was made of grass the country owned, and machinery the country did not, and when the machinery was finally called home, the country was left holding the grass, richer still, in every way that shows in a photograph, and poorer in the one way that only shows in a ledger. A country that was, for 30 years, the answer to the most important question the industrial world was asking: where does the food come from? And then the world learned to ask it somewhere else. If you'd like to keep travelling with us through the places where the world's great fortunes were made and lost and left behind in stone, subscribe and come with us to the next one. Until the next journey.